Hey guys, Coach Logan here with this week's game of the week. And this was a very interesting game, actually played in the under 1000 section. And it was between Mahima from PS10 and Abyl from PS139. And I thought it was a very interesting game. It was not a very long one, but it involved a very interesting attacking idea that really gets at the concept of commitment. So we'll take a look at this. So Mahima was playing white, and she started with pawn to e4, pawn to e5 from black, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. It's an Italian opening. All of this is pretty standard. White played knight c3, which is not the most aggressive move. Usually c3 is considered the main line, but knight c3 is it's a developing move. It can't be too bad. Knight f6. Pawn to d3 and pawn to d6. So we get this position. And here Mahima played bishop g5, potentially threatening knight coming into d5 here. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Threatening maybe to play knight into d5, putting pressure on this pinned knight on f6. So black played h6 here. And here Mahima took the knight, which I don't love that move because it gives up the bishop pair. And, for not that much, like black doesn't even have to double his pawns here. So I think black is doing quite well. And after the move knight to d5, Abyl found the correct response, which is to just retreat the queen back to d8 and defend this pawn. And all things considered, I think black is doing pretty well here. It's a symmetrical position. Black is not really behind in space. Keeping pace with development, could just play a move here like bishop to e6. Oh, sorry, it's white's move. White played queen to d2 here, but it's black's turn now. So I'm saying black could play something like bishop e6 or bishop g4. But instead, black decided to play to castle. Now, objectively, this is okay here. I've looked at this game a couple of times, and black should be able to do this safely. However, it is taking a big risk, and the big risk black is taking is that he's now committing his king to the king side after having already played the move h6. And the reason this could be risky is because white has not castled yet. White has not committed his king, or her, sorry, I should say her king. It's Mahima playing white. White has not committed her king to the king side yet. So the reason this is risky is that white can actually start launching an attack on black's king, and because black has played h6, white has a real chance to open up the file, because if you can imagine her getting this pawn to, say, g4 and g5, this will come in contact with a pawn here, and meaning that the g file is more likely to open, right? If this pawn were still back on h7, then even if white gets a pawn to g5, it's not so easy to open up lines on the king. So with that said, Mahima played a very interesting move here. I'll give her full credit for good aggression. She played pawn to g4. And the idea is pretty simple. She's not messing around. She's looking to play just play g5 and just all systems go on the black king. So Abyl took the pawn, which seems pretty natural. And here, again, I will give Mahima full credit for her aggression. She played rook to g1. Now, we're going to come back to this position. This move, I don't think that this attack should have fully worked, but it turned out very nicely in the game. So let's see what happens. So after rook to g1, black played bishop takes f3, but this landed himself into huge trouble. So what do you think white should play now? So white is now down a pawn and down a piece, but definitely has compensation, more than compensation, overwhelming compensation. In fact, she's just winning. So what should white play here? All right, you can pause your videos if you want more time, but with the g file pinned, or sorry, I should say the pawn on the g file pinned, white is able to just play queen takes h6, and now she's got a very serious threat of queen takes g7 with checkmate. What is black going to do about that? It's not so easy. In the game, black played g6. There's not really anything else he can do, though. He can't really play queen to f6 because the knight could just take, and this is actually checkmate on the spot. So it's really not easy to deal with rook, the threat of queen or rook takes g7, both of which would be checkmate. So black played g6. And here white played knight takes c7, which is probably winning. I mean, white should be winning here. However, she actually had a faster win, so see if you can find what white should play here. Okay, keep the video paused if you want more time. But again, white's pieces are really swarming the black king. This bishop, this knight, the rook and the queen, and the time is now to just start sacrificing to open up lines. Sorry, not knight takes c7, that's what was played. Rook takes g6 just leads to checkmate. Rook takes g6, f takes g6, and now I believe either knight e7 or knight f6 are both checkmate. Those are a double check because the bishop and the knight are checking the king. The only way out of a double check is to move the king, but unfortunately the king has no square to go to. The queen and the bishop are covering all of them. So this would have been a very nice finish. Mahima played knight takes e7, which is probably still winning. It's hard to come up with a move for black here that could try to keep this alive. In the game, Abyl took, and then rook takes g6 was just checkmate because the bishop is pinning the pawn. But again, I mean, it's hard to come up with an idea for black. I think, so the computer's pointing out, maybe knight e7 defends the g6 pawn. So at least black has some chances to keep the game alive. But let's see what's best here. Okay, so the engine is saying just to sacrifice anyway. Knight takes, queen takes with check. Again, note that the pin is the reason we can get away with this. And after king to g8, let's say, or sorry, king to h8, queen to h6 check. The king has to come back to g8. I'd be tempted, I mean, maybe this doesn't work. I'd be tempted to try something like just getting the rook over, but maybe it's more prudent to, okay, so they're pointing out knight to d5 is actually the strongest. This knight is now threatening to come to f6, which is an enormous threat, and it's not at all easy to deal with that because you can't play something like f6 to try to cover the square because this is, again, it's a double check and it's just mate. So, yeah, I don't really know what black can try here. Let's get an engine eval. Yeah, okay, it's giving white as being ahead by a ridiculous amount. I think they're just conceding that black is going to have to basically give up his queen here, or yeah, so something like, trying to turn the engine off now so it's not distracting. But yeah, so black now would have to play something like this, and after knight f6, okay, the queen has to sacrifice, and this is just losing. White's going to collect material, and then the rook will come to the g file, and white's attack is overwhelming. Okay, so a very interesting game. I do want to go back to a couple of positions, though. After bishop takes g4, rook to g1, black actually could have played pawn to h5 rather than grabbing the knight. And now the point is, if white were to, say, try something similar to the game, let's say, I don't know, pawn to h3 with the idea of, after bishop takes on f3, still going with this queen h6 idea. Black has an amazing resource here to keep himself in the game. Okay, pause your videos if you want more time, but black can actually, if we remember, we got queen h6 in because the rook was pinning the g file, but black can actually play bishop back to g4 now, defended by the h-pawn, and the whole point is if white were to take this, now black could actually take the queen and get away with it. So I actually don't quite think this g4 idea was totally, objectively justified, but it certainly gave for a very strong practical attack, and one that black was not able to hold against. And I'll be honest, even, Abyl's a great player, but even, I think even a much higher rated player might have a hard time finding this. After bishop takes g4, rook to g1, it's very scary facing, down the barrel of a rook on a semi-open file on your king. White has potentially, 1, 2, 3, 4, if you leave the knight on the board, 5 pieces that can swarm your king, and it's going to be very difficult to defend that. And yeah, bishop takes f3 did not do the job. h5 was necessary. I think this would have successfully offered defense. Still, after something like, I don't know here, I'm trying to think how white could actually keep this going. I think the engine was saying black was better here. All right, so they're giving queen g5, but that allows a queen trade. I think knight g5 is more in the spirit of the attack, but knight to g5, let's see here. I'm trying to allow this to play, but these types of lines the engine really has to calculate, which burns up its thinking. Oh no, it's playing, let's go knight g5. Yeah, so something like this. Okay, this is actually, I think Sam was pointing this out in the Zoom room, was after knight g5, again, you're sort of getting ready for stuff like h3 and kicking the bishop away and just going all out on the attack, but black could start activating his own pieces for counterplay with knight to d4. And now if you do any shenanigans with your knight, then black will have knight to f3, and black is clearly still in the game at this point. But okay, so again, a very, very interesting game. I think the strategic lesson is, I think the way Abyl played was fine. And even though, again, the computer will tell you castling here is objectively fine, I think there's a good strategic lesson in this, is to, if you can make a good move, if you have a choice between two good moves and one of them is more committal than the other, try to make the one that's less committal, because you don't, there's no reason to make a big commitment unless you have to. Okay, and while castling, the commitment behind castling, the point of it is to get your king safe. Here it didn't really do that. Black's king still had a lot of safety issues to deal with. So I think something like, this was after queen to d2, something like bishop e6 was Sam's suggestion, or bishop g4. Black's king is not, stuck going to the king side. He could still castle queen side or leave it in the center for the time being. The center's not really opening up anytime soon. This, I think, would have represented more sound strategic play. Okay, but a very, very interesting game. Excellent job to both players, and an excellent attack from Mahima. So good job, guys. This was exciting chess in the under 1,000 division.